The last person anyone expected to still be inside the mansion was a child. It was well past midnight when Gabriel Russo returned from a closed-door meeting with the heads of the organization. His guards waited outside, their eyes sharp, watching every entrance with the vigilance of men who had seen too much. Gabriel entered alone, as he always did. The crystal chandelier cast reflections across the polished marble floor, and the silence in the air felt so heavy it bordered on suffocating. Then he heard a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't footsteps or whispering. It was only a faint rustle, the soft scrape of fabric against fabric, drifting from the kitchen area, specifically from the pantry. Instinct made him stop. He quietly drew the pistol from his belt, his calloused hand gripping the cold metal with the certainty of someone who had survived too many nights like this. On any other night, an intruder meant blood. But tonight, his intuition told him this was something worse. Moving slowly toward the pantry door, his breath tightened, his heartbeat steady but strained, he placed a hand on the handle. A small part of him still wished it was only a mouse or a staff member who had forgotten the time. But when the door opened, Gabriel froze. In the dim corner of the room, under the weak sliver of light leaking in from the hall, was a little girl curled up on the floor. Thin, trembling, her wide eyes filled with the kind of fear that looked as if she had been caught stealing bread straight from God's own table. She didn't speak. In her hands was a half-eaten piece of bread and a small plastic container holding a bit of cold pasta someone in the kitchen had thrown away. Gabriel didn't move. The girl didn't either. The moment stretched long enough to feel like a lifetime. Slowly, he lowered his gun and crouched down. She still didn't move, her round eyes reflecting sheer terror. She couldn't have been older than 7, wearing a thin, worn-out jacket and sneakers with the soles coming apart. Her face was pale, her cheeks hollow, her small fingers wrapped tightly around the plastic container, as if it were the last treasure she had left in the world. He knew instantly she wasn't a thief, wasn't a spy. She was hungry. And as Gabriel leaned a little closer, gently, like he was afraid of breaking something fragile, the girl whispered in a voice so soft it seemed to shiver in the air, "Please don't fire my mom. She didn't know I followed her here." Gabriel felt something in his chest pull tight. He recognized her immediately. Sophie, the daughter of Emily Dawson, the young housekeeper who had worked quietly in this home for nearly 3 years. Emily was always on time, never complained, never asked for extra shifts, never spoke about her personal life, and now, in the cold pantry of this vast mansion, Gabriel finally understood why. Little Sophie lowered her head, trying to hide the plastic container behind her back, as though if no one saw it, then her mistake, and her fear, might disappear as well. Gabriel looked at her as if seeing the truth clearly for the first time. A hungry child, hiding in the dark to eat discarded food, terrified beyond words because she only wanted her mother to keep her job. In that moment, Gabriel was no longer the feared kingpin everyone whispered about. He was a man, face to face with a reflection of who he once was in another life. And what he did next would be something no one in that house would ever forget. If you're still listening and this story has touched something quiet and tender inside you, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, like and share this video so we can continue creating heartfelt stories every day. And if you don't mind, tell me, where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and let us know which corner of the world this story has reached. We cherish every word you share with us. Gabriel remained there in the narrow pantry of the opulent mansion, facing a small, trembling figure who was trying to hide a bit of food, as if it were the evidence of an unforgivable sin. Sophie didn't dare look directly into his eyes, yet every tiny movement she made revealed the fear carved deep into her heart. Those eyes, wet and wide and shimmering with the kind of tension that looked ready to spill into tears, pierced straight through the cold armor Gabriel had spent more than 20 years building around himself. In them, he saw not only the fear of being caught, but a fear far greater: fear for her mother. In the silence between them, the little girl was begging not for herself, but for the only person in the world she loved. A tightness rose in Gabriel's throat, forcing him to draw a slow breath. He had looked into the eyes of enemies before pulling a trigger, had confronted gazes full of hatred, betrayal, or despair. But he had never seen eyes like these, innocent yet unyielding, frightened yet quietly brave. Sophie said nothing more. She only bowed her head, her thin shoulders trembling gently. In that moment, Gabriel realized her small hands weren't guarding the cold pasta container, they were trying to protect something much more fragile: her mother's pride. A mother who held onto her job in silence, who was sick, hungry, and struggling, yet refused to bend or beg despite everything falling apart. Gabriel stood up carefully, as if afraid any sudden movement might startle the child. He tucked the gun back into his belt, then crouched down again so he was level with her. Sophie pulled back slightly, gripping the container with both hands. "Your name is Sophie, right?" His voice was low, rough, yet softened in a way he couldn't hide. Sophie didn't speak, but she nodded timidly. He saw the dark shadows beneath her eyes, her cracked lips, the frayed edges of her jacket collar. There was so much to ask, but Gabriel didn't know where to begin. Finally, he let out a quiet sigh. "Your mother is a good woman. She works hard. She's never broken a rule." Sophie lifted her gaze, searching his face for something: hope, judgment, maybe both. Gabriel continued, softer still. "But she didn't know you took the food, did she?" Sophie shook her head over and over, tears beginning to spill. "Please don't blame my mom, I was just hungry. Mom said we don't take charity. She said if we don't have something, we have to deal with it and not take what isn't ours." The words cut into a part of Gabriel's past he had buried long ago. He saw again the image of a boy in a patched shirt, standing silently near the dining table of a crumbling old church where his own thin, overworked mother had once labored. The same eyes, the same quiet pride, the same hunger. It was the feeling that had driven him into this world, had shaped him into someone cold and merciless so he would never again watch someone he loved bow their head in desperation. But now, in Sophie's eyes, Gabriel saw himself not the version molded by blood-soaked deals, but the boy he once was, not yet hardened, still believing in right and wrong, still ashamed of taking too much from others. He sat still for a long moment before slowly extending a hand. "Give that to me." Sophie hesitated, then held out the small plastic container. Gabriel took it, stood, retrieved a clean cloth from a drawer, and gently wiped her hands. They were tiny, dry, and icy cold. No one in this house knew that beneath these marble floors a child had been trembling from hunger. And no one could have imagined that Gabriel Russo, a man who made an entire city tremble, would now be standing motionless, cleaning the hands of a little girl he barely knew, all because of one look in her eyes. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Gabriel turned. It was Frank, one of his most trusted guards, entering the kitchen with a gravelly voice. "Boss, everything okay? I heard something." Gabriel lifted a hand to silence him. "Just checking the pantry. Probably the mice again." Frank nodded and left, though his eyes lingered toward the pantry. When his steps faded away, Gabriel closed the door and turned back to Sophie. His voice was low, but steady. "Stay here, don't move, don't make a sound. I'll be back." Sophie could only nod. She was still frightened, but now there was something else in her eyes: trust. Gabriel walked away, but his heart felt heavier than it had in years. He knew he had just witnessed something he could not ignore. And from that second on, nothing in this house would ever be the same. He stepped out of the kitchen, the pantry door closing softly behind him, holding inside it a secret both fragile and weighty. He walked down the marble corridor with slow steps, his mind racing. Sophie's image clung to him, her small hands clutching discarded food, her pleading gaze meant not for herself, but for her mother. The ache in his chest deepened. He couldn't let it go. He needed to know why a child had to sneak into his house at midnight to find something to eat, and why Emily Dawson, the woman who always worked quietly without a single complaint, had allowed it to happen. He entered his office, shutting the door behind him. The room glowed with warm amber light from an old desk lamp, casting long shadows over the bookshelves and files, giving everything a calmness that felt almost sinister. Gabriel sat down, opened his computer, and accessed the employee database. Emily's file appeared on the screen. Emily Dawson, 28 years old, single, full-time employee at the estate for 3 years. No criminal record, no complaints, no notes of misconduct. But nothing else either. Her file was so clean it was almost invisible. Gabriel opened the security footage, rewinding to that evening. He saw Emily leaving the kitchen a little after 9, walking toward the staff quarters. Nothing unusual. But about 10 minutes later, the camera caught something that made Gabriel lean closer to the screen. A small figure appeared near the heavy iron back door. Sophie. But she didn't walk. She dropped to her hands and knees, crawling flat against the cold stone pavement, slipping underneath the range of the infrared motion sensors. Gabriel felt a chill run down his spine. His multi-million-dollar security system was calibrated to ignore low-to-the-ground movements to prevent false alarms from stray cats or foxes. Sophie, so thin and small from malnutrition, had unwittingly slipped through the only blind spot designed for wild animals. She wasn't using skill. She was using desperation. She had learned to make herself smaller than a sensor's beam just to find a meal. The more he thought, the more anger rose in him, not because Sophie had sneaked in, but because no one in this house had realized a child was hungry enough to do so. And Emily? Why had she remained silent? Why had she said nothing? Gabriel left the office and made his way to the staff quarters. Emily's room was at the end of the hallway near the emergency exit. He stopped at her door, raised a hand to knock, then paused. The light inside was still on. He could hear a cough, raspy, long, tearing through the quiet like something scraping her throat raw. Then the rustle of blankets, followed by strained breaths trying desperately to stay quiet. Gabriel stood motionless. He didn't need to open the door to understand. She was sick. Badly. He turned back to the office and immediately called his private doctor, a man he trusted completely. "I need you here early morning. Someone needs a thorough examination. Respiratory issues." The doctor hesitated, asking if it was serious. Gabriel replied, "I don't know, but I want to know before it gets worse." Then he continued reviewing internal reports. Emily's salary was so low it made him ashamed to look at it. She hadn't requested a raise in 3 years, hadn't asked for extra shifts, hadn't taken a single day off, no complaints, no notes, nothing. Gabriel called the head of HR. "Has anyone ever heard Emily complain about anything?" The voice on the other end paused. "No, sir. She's very quiet. Works extremely hard. I honestly thought she had no family. She's never mentioned a child." Gabriel hung up, feeling a heaviness sink into him. Emily had hidden everything from everyone, out of pride, fear of losing her job, a belief that no one would care. He thought back to the times he had crossed paths with her in the kitchen, in the hallway, in the yard. Her lowered eyes, her small steps, her clipped words. She had made herself invisible on purpose. And the part that chilled him to the bone was realizing he had never noticed not when she was sick, not when her daughter was hungry, not when something had clearly been wrong right under his roof. He had lived too long in a world built on power and control until the most human things had slipped through the cracks. But Sophie had shattered that with a single look. And now Gabriel knew he could no longer ignore what he had seen. It was too clear. A woman slowly breaking under the weight of her own dignity, a child eating scraps in fear, and Gabriel himself standing on the edge of a choice that would change everything. The next morning, Gabriel woke earlier than usual. He didn't go to the meeting room as he always did, nor did he answer the calls from his subordinates. Instead, he stood silently in his office, his eyes fixed on the surveillance monitor. At 6 o'clock, the system automatically shifted to daytime recording mode. In the frame, Emily appeared. She wore her thin, worn-out coat, carried her kitchen tote, her posture slightly hunched as if trying to hide the exhaustion etched into every step. Gabriel watched her every movement, unable to look away. She walked through the corridor, gave the guard a faint nod, then hurried into the kitchen. No one paid her any attention. No one asked how she was. She moved like a muted backdrop in the house familiar enough to be forgotten, but Gabriel could not look away. He switched to the kitchen camera. Emily began preparing breakfast for the staff, her movements practiced and meticulous. Yet something stood out clearly now, something he had failed to see before. She moved slowly, her hands trembling slightly when lifting a pot of water, occasionally coughing into her palm and covering her mouth quickly, as though afraid someone might notice. Gabriel felt a slow, simmering anger rise in his chest, but this time it wasn't anger at her. It was anger at himself for never seeing how weakened she had become. Around 7, he left his office without telling anyone, simply put on his coat and stepped outside. He didn't take his usual car. Instead, he chose a gray SUV few people paid attention to. The vehicle slipped into the early morning flow of Chicago traffic like a shadow. He wanted to know how Emily lived beyond her work. He needed to see the truth with his own eyes. When her shift ended close to 8, Emily left the estate through the side gate. Gabriel followed at a careful distance, close enough not to lose her, far enough not to be noticed. She walked. No taxi, no car. Every step looked measured, deliberate, like someone saving every dollar. She wrapped her scarf tightly around her neck, hands buried deep in her coat pockets. The cold bit at the air, her breath fogging into thin white trails. She crossed 3 blocks, then turned into a narrow street tucked behind a row of old warehouses. Gabriel slowed the SUV, turned off the headlights, relying only on the running lights. Emily stopped in front of an aging 3-story red brick building with rusted iron railings. She unlocked the entrance and slipped inside. Gabriel waited a few minutes, then quietly stepped out and approached the building. The nameplate at the door listed several last names scribbled in marker, many crossed out and replaced with new ones. In the corner, barely legible, Dawson. He returned to his car and called a man named Bennett, someone he used when he needed discreet internal investigations. "I need you to check everything about where Emily Dawson lives. The apartment, the lease, medical history, all of it. Quietly. No one can know." Less than 2 hours later, a report arrived in Gabriel's email. Emily lived on the 3rd floor of that building with her daughter. The apartment had a single small bedroom, barely 400 square feet. Rent was lower than average because the building was deteriorating. The heating system barely worked. In winter, she used an old electric heater. Over the past year, Emily had visited the community health center 3 times due to a persistent cough, but never returned for follow-up. No insurance, no proper medication. The doctor's notes suggested her condition was progressing toward chronic pneumonia. Gabriel tightened his grip on the phone. He inhaled deeply, trying to steady himself, but he couldn't ignore the guilt gnawing at him. Emily had asked for nothing, had begged no one. She had simply endured pain, hunger, fear, while continuing to work, as if everything were fine. And her daughter, a girl of 7, had quietly endured hunger and cold, sneaking into the estate at night to pick up scraps of food to get through the day. Gabriel looked out the car window. Snow had begun to fall, each flake tapping gently against the glass like a whisper of something he could no longer turn away from. He didn't know exactly what was happening inside him, only that since the moment Sophie looked at him last night, he had not been himself. Something had shifted, and that something compelled him to act, now. The following morning, Gabriel entered the kitchen earlier than usual. The kitchen was still quiet, filled only with the soft rhythm of knives against cutting boards, the clink of pots, and the faint aroma of fresh coffee drifting in the air. Emily stood at the stove, stirring eggs in an old nonstick pan. She wore a faded apron, her hair tied back, her posture slightly bent as always. Gabriel paused at the doorway, watching her in silence. Every movement she made carried an ache hidden beneath her practiced ease. He stepped forward, his shoes tapping lightly against the marble floor. Emily turned and startled at the sight of him. "Mr. Russo." Her voice was soft, unsteady. Is something wrong?" Gabriel didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat at the large staff table used only at lunchtime. "Sit." His voice was low, calm. Emily froze, her eyes widening. "Sir, if I've done something wrong," Gabriel interrupted gently. "I'm not here to reprimand you. I want to talk. Sit." She hesitated, then carefully pulled the chair across from him, sitting on the edge as though ready to flee at any moment. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Gabriel looked directly into her eyes. "I know about Sophie." Emily went rigid. Her face drained of color in an instant. "Sir, I'm so sorry. She didn't mean any harm. I'll talk to her. Gabriel raised a hand, quiet, firm. "She didn't do anything wrong." Emily opened her mouth, then froze. Gabriel continued. "I want to know why you never said anything. About your condition, about your daughter, about the fact that you're fighting to get through each day." Emily lowered her head, her eyes reddening. "Sir, I didn't think it was anyone's business. I come here to work. I do my job. I don't want pity. I don't ask anyone for anything." She drew a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. "Sophie. She shouldn't have been here. She was just hungry. I haven't been able to buy enough food these past few days. My medication, it costs too much." Her voice cracked. Gabriel fell silent. She had chosen pain, chosen hunger, chosen silence rather than ask for help, not out of pride, but out of a mother's fierce dignity, refusing to become a burden. He softened his voice. "What medication do you need? How serious is your condition?" "I'm fine, I just need rest. But Sophie needs to attend school. I can't miss work. If I do, we have nothing to eat." Emily spoke quickly, as though afraid that stopping would shatter whatever strength she had left. "I know she's thin. I know she's tired, but I've done everything I can. I don't want anyone to see us as people to be pitied." Gabriel nodded slowly. "I don't see you that way, Emily. I see you as strong. But being strong doesn't mean suffering alone. You don't have to be invisible in this house anymore. From now on, things will be different." Emily lifted her gaze, her eyes brimming with tears. "Different how, sir? Are you going to fire me? Take Sophie away?" Gabriel held her gaze for a long moment. "No. I'm going to take you to the best doctor I know. I'm going to make sure you get proper treatment. Sophie as well, and if you agree, we'll find a long-term solution together." Emily shook her head faintly. "I don't have money to pay for that. I can't." Gabriel gently shook his head. "You don't have to pay. Think of it as an order, if that helps. You and your daughter don't have to fight alone anymore. You deserve help. You've been silent for far too long." At those words, Emily finally broke. Not loudly, just a soft, trembling release, the sound of someone whose burden had suddenly become too heavy to hold alone. Gabriel said nothing more. He simply sat there, watching the woman across from him, not an invisible servant, but a human being who was hurting, afraid, yet still holding on to her dignity. And he knew this was only the beginning. Something was shifting, quiet but irreversible, spreading through the walls of his home and through the chambers of his own heart. That night, Gabriel did not sleep. He sat alone in his office, the warm amber glow from the desk lamp settling over the dark wood walls and the silent bookshelves that seemed to hold secrets never meant to be spoken. Outside the window, snow continued falling, heavier than in the afternoon. The flakes clung to the glass, blurring the distant streetlights into a soft, muted haze. In his hands was a printed copy of the preliminary medical report his private doctor had just sent. Chronic pneumonia, severe weakness caused by prolonged malnutrition, weakened immunity, high risk of complications without proper and timely treatment. He read every line slowly, not allowing himself to skip a single word. Each sentence felt like a small blade slicing into the false sense of order he had once believed he controlled. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, gripping the armrests tightly, his mind echoing with Emily's voice as she sat across from him in the kitchen that morning. "No one needs to know. I don't ask anyone for anything. I don't want anyone's pity." She had spoken those words with a dry steadiness, but deep in her eyes had been a kind of despair only those who had lived it could recognize. Gabriel found himself remembering his own early years, living in a damp basement apartment with his mother, the landlord knocking for rent on the first of every month, his mother shrugging with a faint, weary smile, making porridge with more water than rice so it would last the week. And he, a 12-year-old boy then, had sworn he would never let his mother bow her head again. But she had not lived long enough to see him fulfill that vow. Now, in front of him, was a woman living the life his mother once lived, with no one to shoulder the burden alongside her. And there was a child, too, just like he had been, learning what hunger felt like, what helplessness tasted like, what it meant to watch your mother grow thinner each day while you could do nothing. Gabriel rose and walked to the wall safe. He unlocked it, revealing stacks of cash, documents, expensive watches, and a worn leather notebook he kept separate from everything else. It contained records of major deals, figures, debts collected or outstanding. But tonight, he didn't open it to calculate anything. He took a blank sheet of paper and scribbled a few lines. "Tomorrow morning, call Dr. Reeves. Full examination for Emily Dawson. All expenses from my personal account. No updates needed." He placed the note on his desk, then picked up his phone. The first call was to his financial advisor. He wanted to establish a healthcare fund for low-level staff, effective immediately. No announcements, only results. The second call went to the head of HR. Rewrite Emily's employment contract, raise her salary, add benefits. She does not need to request anything. Do it quietly, thoroughly, without drawing attention. The third call he did not make. It was the one he meant to place to himself a silent confrontation with the past, with the years he had dismissed kindness as weakness, compassion as a flaw. But tonight, for the first time in a very long time, he no longer felt that softness was a liability. Gabriel turned back to the window. The city remained lit, alive, unaware that inside this mansion, a decision had just been made quietly, almost breathlessly. No gunshots, no blood, no multi-million-dollar contract. Only a child eating cold pasta in the dark, and a mother coughing herself awake every night because she could not afford medicine. And that alone was enough to change Gabriel Russo. He blew out the candle on his desk and stepped farther inside. The night was still long, but tomorrow, everything would be different. When the first light of morning filtered through the large windows of the estate, Gabriel was already prepared. He wore a dark suit without a tie and walked into the kitchen at 6:15 earlier than everyone else. Emily wasn't there. The absence instantly sharpened his focus. She had never been late, not once in 3 years. He turned to Frank, who was passing by. "Where's Emily?" Frank frowned slightly. "Haven't seen her yet, sir." Gabriel pulled out his phone and called Dr. Reeves directly. "I need you at Emily Dawson's apartment, right now. She's very sick. I'll send the address in 1 minute." He hung up and immediately messaged Bennett, who was still monitoring the building where Emily lived. Within 2 minutes, Bennett reported back. The lights in her apartment weren't on, the door was locked from the inside, and heavy coughing could be heard through the door. Gabriel didn't waste another second. He headed to the car and drove himself. The gray SUV cut through the freezing morning air, gliding past streets still wrapped in mist. In less than 20 minutes, he reached the old brick building. He went straight to the 3rd floor. When he knocked, there was no answer. He pressed his ear to the door. The coughing was weaker now, but harsher, more persistent, dry and heavy like something tearing inside her chest. Without hesitation, Gabriel signaled for Frank to break the door. It burst open, releasing a wave of cold air and the stale smell of dampness. Emily lay curled on an old sofa covered by a thin blanket. She didn't open her eyes, her breathing strained and rapid. Her face was pale, her hair damp with sweat, her lips cracked and dry. The room held almost no warmth. A small space heater sat in the corner, unplugged long ago. Gabriel knelt beside her and spoke softly. "Emily." She opened her eyes weakly, attempting to sit up but failing. "Mr. Russo, I'm sorry. I couldn't make it in. I'll come back to work." Gabriel gently held her hand, feeling the unnatural coldness in her skin. "Don't speak. You're going to the hospital. The doctor is on his way. You're going to be all right." "Sir." "Sophie," she whispered. Gabriel looked around. The small apartment held only one bed, a chipped dresser, and a few photos on the wall. No sign of the child. "Where is Sophie?" Emily tried to move but couldn't answer. Dr. Reeves arrived with 2 nurses. He quickly checked her vitals, listened to her lungs, then nodded sharply to the nurses. "Severe pneumonia. Signs of oxygen deficiency, dehydration, serious exhaustion. We need to move her immediately." Gabriel nodded. "Use my car. VIP room. Send all charges to me. I want every necessary test done the moment we arrive." Dr. Reeves gave him a brief look of surprise but didn't question him. As Emily was carried downstairs, Gabriel lingered in the apartment for a moment longer. The room was cold and bare, but on the table sat a familiar plastic container, the one Sophie had held that night. Next to it was a small pencil note. "I ate already. Mom, this is your part. Today, I'll be good." At the bottom was a wobbly drawing of a smiling face. Gabriel folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. He called out to Frank. "Find Sophie, immediately. Check the school. Contact her teacher. Anywhere she might go. Don't frighten her." Frank nodded and hurried out, clearly understanding the weight behind the order. Gabriel took one last look around the apartment, then turned to leave, his chest tight. He had walked through hundreds of homes like this in his life, had witnessed misery in every shape and form. But never had he felt accountable the way he did now. Emily had kept her word. She had done her job. Never complained, never asked for anything, not even when her body was giving out. And that was exactly why Gabriel could not ignore her. As the private ambulance pulled away, carrying Emily far from the crumbling building, Gabriel stood at the curb, still holding Sophie's small note in his hand. The snow was falling harder now. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel the cold. He felt anger. Not at Emily's weakness, but at a world that forced people like her to endure so much before collapsing. And he vowed, from this day forward, that things would change. Not only for Emily, but for everyone he had unknowingly allowed to fade into the quiet shadows of his life. That afternoon, as the sun slipped behind the snow-covered rooftops, a silver car rolled to a stop at the side gate of the Russo estate. The door opened, and a little girl with a worn backpack stepped out, her face pale, her hands gripping the straps as if they were the only safe thing she had left in the world. Sophie Dawson stood still before the tall iron gate, staring up at the mansion as though it were suddenly too foreign, too towering, too cold compared to every other time she had seen it. She had never arrived here alone. But today, the school had called the estate when no one came to pick Sophie up as usual. And only minutes later, Gabriel had sent someone to bring her without a moment's hesitation. Sophie took small steps across the courtyard, her anxious eyes darting around. She saw no sign of her mother, no familiar face. The sky darkened, the leafless branches swaying gently in the wind. At the kitchen entrance, Gabriel was already waiting. No one spoke for the first few seconds. Then Sophie whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "My mom. She didn't come for me." Gabriel crouched to meet her gaze, his expression softening. The coldness he was known for, nowhere to be found. "Your mother is in the hospital, but the best doctors are taking care of her. She's going to be all right." Sophie stared at him, her lips pressed tight, her eyes filling. "I'm sorry, I think it's my fault she got sick." Gabriel stilled. The words hit him like a slap from memory. He rested a hand on Sophie's small shoulder, his voice low but firm. "No, it's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." Sophie didn't look up. She murmured, "I stole food. My mom didn't know. If she knew, she'd be very sad." Gabriel exhaled slowly. "No one should ever have to steal food, Sophie. Especially a child. You were trying to survive, and the fact that you love your mother enough to do that? That's not a mistake. That's something brave." She finally lifted her face, her eyes wide and shimmering. "You're not mad at me?" "No." He shook his head. "Not angry. Only sorry I didn't know sooner. If I had, I wouldn't have let you or your mother suffer like this." He stood and offered his hand. "Do you want to come inside? It's very cold out here." Sophie hesitated, then nodded. Her small hand slipped into his, warming slowly in the quiet certainty of a man she had always watched from afar. They walked inside. The mansion was as it always was, vast, spotless, hushed. But this time, Sophie no longer felt like an intruder. Gabriel led her to a small sitting room near the library. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering light over the dark wooden shelves. A small sofa sat beside a low table where a cup of hot chocolate and a neatly folded thick blanket awaited her. Sophie settled onto the couch, wrapping both hands around the warm ceramic cup. Her eyes followed the flames while Gabriel sat nearby, leaving just enough distance not to overwhelm her. "Your mother will stay in the hospital for a few days, maybe a week," he said quietly. "But while she's there, you'll stay here. With me. We'll take care of her together." Sophie didn't answer, but he saw her nod faintly. A single tear slipped down her cheek, not trembling, not frightened, just a gentle surrender after holding herself together for far too long. Gabriel sat with her, saying nothing more. In that room filled with firelight and the scent of cocoa, for the first time he felt the mansion breathe like a home, not because of its warmth or luxury, but because, in that moment, between two people who had once been strangers, something genuine had been exchanged. Trust. And to Gabriel Russo, That was more valuable than anything he had ever owned. After Sophie finished her hot chocolate, Gabriel led her upstairs to the second floor, not to the staff quarters or the guest wing, but to the private hallway few had ever entered. Sophie followed cautiously, her eyes absorbing everything: the large framed paintings lining the walls, the thick carpet muffling their footsteps, the soft gold glow of crystal chandeliers high above them. Gabriel stopped in front of a heavy wooden door, rested his hand on the knob, then looked at her. "Tonight, you're having dinner here with me." Sophie blinked, startled. "I... here?" He nodded. "No one else. Just you and me. Tonight is for special guests." He opened the door. Inside was his main dining room, reserved for high-level meetings, clandestine dinners where even the servers left immediately after setting the table. The long walnut table stretched the length of the room, flanked by velvet wine-colored chairs. A pristine white tablecloth lay perfectly pressed beneath gold-rimmed porcelain plates that glimmered under the chandelier. Sophie froze at the threshold. She had never seen a place like this, never imagined she would sit at such a table. Seeing her hesitate, Gabriel crouched again and pointed to a chair near the head of the table. "That's your seat?" She stepped forward, her back hunched slightly, her footsteps tiny as though afraid of dirtying the carpet. When she sat, her feet didn't touch the floor, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her shirt, her wide eyes fixed on the table. Gabriel pressed a small button beneath the table, and within a minute, the estate's head chef Giuseppe entered. The older man, with silvering hair and a crisp white apron, bowed. "Good evening, Mr. Russo. I'm ready." Gabriel nodded, then turned to Sophie. "Tonight you choose the menu." Her eyes widened, looking from the chef to Gabriel. I can choose?" He smiled. "Anything you want. Giuseppe will make it perfectly." Sophie hesitated, then whispered, If it's okay. I just want grilled cheese. And maybe tomato soup?" Gabriel nodded. "Grilled cheese and tomato soup, Giuseppe?" The chef smiled. "A simple dish, yet when done right, it can be a masterpiece. A meal worthy of an honored guest." When he left, Gabriel looked back at Sophie and saw a small smile appear on her face for the first time. "I really like that," she said softly. "At school, we have it sometimes, but the bread is cold and there's hardly any cheese. When I get really hungry, I imagine having a big one. A hot one." Gabriel didn't speak, but something heavy inside him felt as if it were melting. Minutes later, Giuseppe returned, carrying a silver tray with a pristine white plate at its center. On it was a perfectly toasted sandwich, the bread golden and crisp, cheese melting over the edges, accompanied by a steaming bowl of deep red tomato soup and 3 warm chocolate cookies still soft in the middle. Sophie stared at it as if it were unreal. "Can I eat now?" Gabriel nodded. She held the sandwich with both hands, took a small bite, then closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were bright with a joy Gabriel had never seen from any guest who had ever sat at this table. When the meal ended, Sophie wiped her mouth with a napkin and turned to him. "Mr. Russo, thank you. This is the best dinner I ever had." Gabriel went still. No one had ever said such words to him. No one had ever thanked him for a meal. But this child, the same child who had been hiding in a pantry nights ago, eating leftovers in fear, was now looking at him with pure gratitude and quiet happiness. And in that moment, Gabriel understood that this dinner had fed more than Sophie's hunger. It had reached into a part of his own heart he thought had died long ago and brought a piece of it back to life. The air in the dining room was warm, almost tender, as though the fire in the hearth had quietly spread its glow into every corner. Sophie sat up straight, her tiny hands gently turning the second cup of hot chocolate between her palms. Her cheeks were flushed, warmed not just by the heat, but by the joy lingering from what had been the best dinner of her life. Gabriel sat across from her, watching in silence. He had never seen anyone eat with such gratitude, never witnessed a happiness as pure as the smile on the little girl in front of him. No demands, no expectations, just a brightening in her eyes because someone had asked what she wanted and truly listened. In a quiet moment, Sophie set her cup down. She lifted her gaze toward Gabriel, her eyes no longer hesitant but filled with something deeper. Something that had been waiting a long time to be spoken. Mr. Russo, will my mom get better? Gabriel nodded, his voice steady. She's getting the best care. Dr. Reeves is the finest in the city. Sophie bit her lip, silent for several seconds before whispering, My mom always says we have to be strong, that we shouldn't bother other people. Gabriel nodded again. She's right. But that doesn't mean you and your mother have to endure everything alone. Sophie looked up, and something in her expression struck Gabriel more deeply than any negotiation he'd ever faced. Mr. Russo, can I ask you something? Gabriel tilted his head slightly. Of course. Anything. She drew a deep breath, her eyes widening, shimmering, earnest in a way that made his chest tighten. Am I important? The question floated into the air like a soft breeze, yet pierced straight into Gabriel's ribs like a blade he never saw coming. He froze. Every sound in the room evaporated. The fire still crackled, the snow still fell beyond the window, but he heard only those 6 words, echoing again and again in his mind. Am I important? A 7-year-old child, once hungry enough to steal scraps, once hiding in the dark to avoid being seen at all, was asking him something so simple, and yet the most devastating question he had ever encountered. He remembered the first night he saw Sophie, her trembling eyes, her hands wrapped protectively around that plastic food box as though guarding the entire world. He remembered Emily collapsed on the sofa, breath shallow, but still asking about her daughter before anything else. 2 people surviving each day by believing they had to be small, invisible, unimportant to deserve a place in the world. Gabriel bowed his head for a moment, his hands tightening slightly on the table. Then he looked up and held Sophie's gaze, his voice low, rough at the edges. Right now, you are the most important person in this house. Sophie blinked, unbelieving. Gabriel continued. Your mother gave up everything so you could grow up. You endured hunger, cold, and fear just so she wouldn't lose her job. A child who can love like that isn't just important. She's precious. More precious than any contract. More than any profit I've ever made. Sophie's lips trembled, her eyes filling. A tear slipped down onto the table, then another. But these weren't tears of fear or hurt. They were tears of release, tears of finally being seen. Gabriel rose, walked around the table and knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her small shoulder. I'm sorry you ever had to ask that. You should never have to doubt your worth. From this moment on, you won't need to ask anyone that question ever again, because you'll always know the answer. Sophie nodded, tears falling but her shoulders relaxing for the first time. She leaned into him softly, as though she had only now been given permission to do so. And Gabriel, the man who once could make an entire city tremble, simply held the little girl who was learning for the first time that she deserved to be loved. Inside his chest, a door opened that he knew he would never let close again. Later, when Sophie fell asleep on the large sofa, clutching her worn-out stuffed rabbit, Gabriel lifted her gently and carried her to the guest room he had chosen for her. The room was warm, quiet, bathed in the soft glow of a bedside lamp. He pulled the blanket up to her chest and stood there a moment longer, making sure she was truly safe, truly at peace. Then he left quietly and returned to his office, the room that had seen hundreds of secret meetings and thousands of contracts signed under pressure. But tonight, he was about to do something entirely different. Closing the door behind him, he activated the security mode, pulled his private phone from the desk drawer, and dialed a number he never imagined using for anything personal. Michael, his longtime lawyer, answered on the third ring. "Gabriel, what's going on? It's late." "I need you at the estate immediately," Gabriel said. "No assistance. And bring the templates for financial trust agreements, minor guardianship trusts, and all documents related to welfare credits." There was a brief pause before Michael replied, his tone shifting. "I understand. I'm on my way." Gabriel didn't stop there. He called Dr. Reeves, requesting every detail of Emily's medical records, prescriptions, treatment plans, recovery care, nursing fees, physical therapy schedules, and nutritional requirements. Then he opened the organization's internal financial system and pulled up the monthly expenditure reports for the estate, scanning a figure he had always dismissed: the amount of food wasted each week, the cost of private dinners, the security budget for unused wings of the mansion. Each number flashed before him like a blow to the conscience. While Sophie ate dry bread in the dark, his kitchen threw away enough food each week to feed 3 families. He stared at the untouched glass of whiskey on the desk he didn't remember pouring it, and pushed it aside. No desire for it now. When Michael arrived, dawn was close. The lawyer found Gabriel hunched over a sheet of paper with frayed edges, handwriting firm yet slightly crooked, mirroring the turmoil inside him. "Who is the child?" Michael asked as he sat down and opened his briefcase. Gabriel lifted his gaze, his expression somber. "Her name is Sophie, Emily's daughter. Emily has worked here for 3 years. Never once complained, never asked for overtime, never mentioned her personal life. Now I understand why." Michael began taking notes. "You want to establish a trust? Not just a trust. I want a comprehensive financial package for both of them. An education fund until Sophie turns 25, tuition, living expenses, books, even study abroad support if needed, and a long-term medical care fund for Emily. No time limits. Treat her until she's truly well. If it takes 10 years, I'll cover it." Michael paused, studying him carefully, then asked the question Gabriel expected. "Is this repayment? Or are you doing this out of guilt?" Gabriel looked toward the window, where a faint light was beginning to seep through the thick glass. "I don't know anymore, Michael. Maybe both. But not because I feel guilty. Because for the first time in 20 years, I feel the need to do something right, not for gain, not for strategy. Just because it's right." Michael nodded slowly. He understood. This was the first time the cold, calculating man he had worked for sounded like someone who could hurt. Someone who could care. They spent over 2 hours finalizing the required documents. Gabriel signed everything without a moment's hesitation. Then he unlocked the safe and retrieved a different file, one sealed with his personal fingerprint, a list of assets he had never disclosed to anyone. A lakeside estate in Vermont, 2 luxury apartments in Manhattan, shares in 3 tech companies, and a hidden account with enough money to last an ordinary family 3 generations. He pointed to it. "I want a portion transferred into a beneficiary account for Sophie, in case anything happens to me, so she never fears hunger again." Michael paused, stunned. "Gabriel, you're serious about this?" "Very serious. Serious enough that I've considered adopting her if Emily doesn't recover soon. But I won't decide alone. I'll wait for Emily's word." When the sun finally rose, light spilling through the tall windows of the estate, Gabriel leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He had never felt this exhausted, but he had also never felt this steady, this clear. He knew that from this moment forward, his life would not look the same, and he had no desire for it to. The stark white light above her made Emily wince as she slowly resurfaced, her mind spinning as though she had just been dragged up from the center of a storm. The sharp scent of antiseptic reached her first, followed by the steady beeping of a heart monitor beside the bed and the weight of an IV needle taped into the back of her hand. She was in a hospital, but not the crowded, frigid public clinic she had visited a few times when fever or exhaustion left her no choice. This place was clean, quiet, serene white sheets, thick curtains of expensive fabric, a high ceiling with soft, recessed lighting. She blinked several times, trying to sit up, when the door swung open and a man in a white coat stepped inside with a gentle smile. "Emily Dawson, you're awake. I'm Dr. Reeves, the attending physician for your case. You've been unconscious for almost 2 days. We've given you intensive treatment. The severe pneumonia is under control, but you'll need time to recover." Emily tried to speak, but her throat burned as if scraped raw. She swallowed hard and looked at him, her voice cracked and thin. Why am I here? I don't have money. I can't pay for this." Dr. Reeves simply smiled with a quiet reassurance. "Your expenses are already covered, Emily. You don't have to worry about anything." Mr. Why? Gabriel Russo arranged it all. The name hit her harder than any medication. Gabriel? Her employer? The doctor nodded and set a file on the table beside the bed. "You should rest, but someone wants to see you, if you feel awake enough." Before she could respond, the door opened again, and Gabriel walked in. Not in his usual expensive black suit, not with the icy authority that made entire rooms fall silent, but as a man who looked exhausted, with shadows under his eyes and worry etched plainly across his face. He paused at the doorway, as though unsure whether he had the right to step into this fragile space. Emily didn't speak. Neither did he. Their eyes met for several seconds, heavy with silence and tangled emotions. Then he stepped forward, pulled a chair close, and sat beside her bed. "Sophie is safe," he finally said. "She's at the estate. She's eating well and sleeping soundly. You don't have to worry." Emily closed her eyes as tears slipped down her temples. "I'm so sorry. She didn't know. I would never have allowed." "I know," Gabriel cut in, softer than she had ever heard him. "She did nothing wrong, and neither did you. I simply didn't see." Emily opened her eyes, uncertainty filling them. "Why are you helping me? Why me? You could have fired me, called the police, thrown us out, and no one would dare object. But you didn't." Gabriel exhaled slowly. "Because I've been hungry before. I watched my mother cut her own meals in half so I could eat. And because your daughter reminded me of that. She didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't complain. She only asked me not to fire you." That one sentence changed everything. Emily turned her head away as shame and gratitude collided fiercely inside her chest. "I don't want pity. I just want to work honestly." "This isn't pity," Gabriel said, firm but gentle. "It's what's right." He leaned forward slightly. "I've established a medical fund to cover your entire treatment, and an educational trust for Sophie until she reaches adulthood. Everything is already signed." Emily stared at him, unable to comprehend what she was hearing. He continued, voice low but unwavering. "You don't need to return as a housemaid. I want you to run the entire staff system of the estate, with proper pay. I need someone like you in that position, someone who sees what others overlook. And Sophie? Sophie needs to know she isn't invisible." Emily pressed her lips together as tears streamed freely. Since her husband died, she had lived for one purpose only, to keep Sophie from suffering the way she once had. She never expected anyone to reach out a hand to them, least of all someone like Gabriel Russo, the powerful, feared man she'd only known from a distance. And yet here he was, sitting beside her like a human being. That alone felt impossible. Finally, she nodded slowly, tentatively, as though too sudden a movement might shatter everything. "Thank you. Thank you for seeing us." Gabriel squeezed her hand lightly, saying nothing. The gesture was small, but in the quiet hospital room, it echoed like a promise. A promise that neither of them had expected. A promise that marked the beginning of something neither could have foreseen. A week after Emily woke and began her recovery, the Gabriel Russo estate welcomed her back with something entirely unlike the silent mornings she had once known. No hurried footsteps across cold marble floors, no averted gazes from other staff, and not even a hint of the invisibility that used to cling to her like a shadow. Gabriel was not waiting at the gate, nor in the main hall, but his presence was in everything. The private car assigned to bring her home from the hospital, the neatly hung new uniform tailored just for her, and the thick employment contract placed carefully on the wooden desk in the second-floor study room. That room was the first gift he ever gave her. The study had once been among the most private spaces in the entire mansion, reserved for only his closest associates or the rare important guest. Now it had been transformed into her workspace. The bookshelves had been polished, new filing cabinets added, a modern computer placed at the center of the desk, and beside it a small framed photo of Sophie smiling brightly with her stuffed rabbit in hand. When Emily stepped inside, the room felt reborn. She froze. Never in her life had she imagined sitting in a room like this, let alone having someone prepare it for her. On the desk lay her new contract, already signed by Gabriel, naming her as the Chief Personnel and Internal Operations Supervisor. Triple her former salary, full benefits, and the most meaningful of all, a handwritten note at the bottom. No longer a housemaid, this is a beginning. Emily touched the words with trembling fingers, unsure if she was dreaming or awake. She had never asked for anything, never expected recognition. Yet now she was being given not just the chance to survive, but the chance to live as someone valued, trusted, respected. Gabriel entered just as she was standing there in stunned silence. He nodded, then approached. "I want you to oversee all staff operations, rebuild the system. This estate runs because of people like you. I just refused to see it before." Emily clutched the contract, still hesitant to believe. She whispered, "You didn't have to do all this." Gabriel met her gaze, his eyes calm but deep. "But I wanted to. And not just for you. For Sophie. She's changed me more than an entire lifetime ever did." Emily turned her face away as tears slipped down again. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to absorb something that felt like it belonged in fiction rather than real life. But she knew one thing. Gratitude was not something she would let pass like a breeze. She would live worthy of this chance for herself and for her daughter. Gabriel set the study's key on the desk, along with a personal access card to the estate's internal management system. He stood to leave when Emily called softly, "Mr. Gabriel." He paused. "Thank you for seeing me." Gabriel didn't turn around, but his voice carried clearly back to her. "I didn't just see you. I forgot you were a person. And I'm correcting that now." The door closed behind him. Emily sat in the chair, opened the first folder, and for the first time in her life, began a job not for survival, but for belief. Down the hall, behind that same closed door, Sophie was studying with her new tutor. Everything had changed. And it all began with one gift, not money, not power, but the simple acknowledgement that she was worthy. From the very first morning Emily took her new position, something in the mansion shifted quietly but unmistakably. The nods became colder, the already rare greetings grew even sparser. She could feel the scrutiny in the eyes of several longtime staff members, especially among Gabriel's inner circle of guardsmen who treated the estate as if it were their own territory and who had long considered her invisible. Emily was no stranger to being looked down on, but this time the air around her felt different. It wasn't passive disdain anymore. It was resentment being held under a taut surface. Gabriel could give her a title, place her in a seat of authority, but no one could be forced to respect someone who climbed out of the lower ranks overnight. And in a world where loyalty was bought with fear rather than admiration, change always drew backlash. Marco, Gabriel's long-standing right hand, was the first to speak, though only behind closed doors. During a private meeting with the senior security team, he stared at the updated personnel list Emily had reorganized and muttered, cold and precise. A maid turned supervisor. Next thing you know, Gabriel will hand her the ledgers to balance. Dry, mocking laughter flickered around the room. Everyone understood the meaning behind his words, and no one challenged him. They had all grown accustomed to the way Gabriel ruled. Firm, absolute, emotionless. His recent changes from bringing an unknown child into the estate to paying a housemaid's medical bills were shaking the confidence of men who had built their identities around his ruthless consistency. They didn't say it aloud, but all of them were waiting for a sign that this was temporary, that Gabriel would wake up soon. And if he didn't, some were already imagining what it meant for a new hand to reassert control. One of the core members, Jackson, even sought Marco out after hours. The two men sat in the surveillance room, the screens casting pale light over their faces as they watched the estate from every angle. Jackson took a drag from his cigarette, his gaze fixed on a frame showing Emily speaking with the kitchen staff. "You think Gabriel's slipping?" he murmured. "I mean, mentally?" Marco didn't answer right away. He stared at the screen for a long time before sighing. Not slipping, but losing direction. And when a man like Gabriel loses direction, the whole organization loses with him. Jackson nodded. They said nothing more, but the thought had already rooted itself between them. If Gabriel didn't return to the man he once was, someone else might feel entitled to restore order in his place. Meanwhile, Emily, though aware of the coldness around her, kept her composure. She didn't argue, didn't force friendliness, didn't defend herself. She just worked carefully, methodically, without complaint. And it was precisely this silence that irritated some even more, because they couldn't find a mistake to weaponize against her. Gabriel watched everything from a distance. He knew what was happening. He knew about the whispered conversations behind his back, but he didn't intervene, not because he was weakened, but because this time he was testing them. For years he had ruled through fear, but now he wanted to see whether loyalty could hold without the crack of a whip. That evening, when Emily submitted her first report, Gabriel said nothing. He simply nodded and slid a small wooden box across the table. Inside was a metal nameplate engraved with her new title, Emily Dawson, Head of Internal Operations. Beneath it lay a handwritten note, "Keep working. Those who oppose won't last long in this world." When she held the plate, it felt like a thin layer of armor settling over her shoulders. Perhaps she wasn't liked, but she had been chosen, and in this place, that meant more than approval. A week after receiving the engraved nameplate from Gabriel, the simmering unrest in the estate finally rose to the surface. The kitchen staff became more cautious around her. The security teams grew colder. Documents she requested were increasingly delayed without explanation. And then everything erupted on a Friday morning when Emily summoned all department heads for an internal meeting to review the new operational structure. The third-floor meeting room was rarely used, its dark wood walls and wide glass windows overlooking the back gardens giving it a solemn, almost ceremonial stillness. But that morning it felt like a battlefield waiting for a spark. Emily stood at the head of the table, neatly prepared folders in front of her. She spoke clearly, concisely, without embellishment or condescension. But as soon as she finished outlining the new staffing strategy, including rotating guard shifts and trimming several unnecessary posts, Marco slammed his hand on the table. "Who exactly do you think you're talking to?" he snapped. "Who gave you the right to change a system we've run for nearly a decade?" Several eyes flicked toward him, then back to Emily. Her heartbeat raced, but her stance did not falter. "I'm doing the job I was assigned to do," she said calmly. "These adjustments were approved by Mr. Russo himself. If you have concerns, I'm willing to document them, but please refrain from raising your voice. This is a meeting, not a pit fight." Marco let out a sharp, humorless laugh as he leaned back in his chair. "Sure, Gabriel appointed you. We all know why. A woman pulled out of the kitchen, never managed a team in her life, now ordering us around. You think caring for one child means you get to rewrite your fate forever?" A few guards snickered under their breath. One of them murmured just loud enough for her to hear that the house was growing weaker because of cheap sentiment. Emily clenched her hands beneath the table, but her voice stayed composed. "If you believe I'm unqualified, you may take it up directly with Mr. Russo. But I'm not here to validate myself to you. I'm here because someone believes this house needs to change, and real change is never comfortable." Marco shot to his feet, his chair crashing backward. "Then you'd better watch yourself. Because change comes with consequences. You're not the first to think you can rewrite how things work in this world." He stormed out, the door slamming behind him. No one else spoke. Emily scanned the room, then quietly closed her folder. "The meeting is over. Thank you for attending." When the others filed out, she remained alone. Morning light streamed through the tall windows, but it wasn't enough to warm the room. She understood now that she was surrounded not by weapons, but by stares, whispers, and the fragile, shifting ground of shaken loyalty. She knew one wrong step could undo everything. But she also knew that if she backed down now, all the change Gabriel had risked would become a mockery. Later that afternoon, as she reviewed the scheduling system again, Gabriel entered the study. He didn't ask if she was all right. Instead, he set an envelope on the desk. Inside was a performance statement bearing his signature. "Emily is carrying out the restructuring plan as intended. Objections based on emotion will not be acknowledged." He looked at her, needing no additional words. She nodded. In Gabriel's eyes, there was none of the softness from the day he brought her home from the hospital, only trust. Cold, sharp, weighted trust. And Emily understood, more clearly than ever, if she wanted to keep this position, she would have to fight for it. Gabriel could shield her from the outside world, but inside this mansion, she would have to learn how to survive. And this time, she did not intend to lose. On what should have been an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, Sophie was taken to the back garden by her tutor to play after lessons. The carefully pruned rose bushes and the soft lawn stretching beneath the gentle sunlight made the garden look like a portrait of peace. But that peace lasted only until the little girl accidentally overheard two men talking near the row of storage sheds. Sophie wasn't trying to eavesdrop. She was simply curious because their voices sounded angry. As she moved closer, she slipped behind a shrub, crouched down, and hugged her stuffed rabbit tight against her chest. One of the men was Jackson, the other was Marco. They were talking about her using her name with a tone dripping with contempt. "That kid is a weakness. Gabriel's letting emotion take over, and it all starts with that little girl. If you want to throw him off balance, all you have to do is touch the right spot." "And what exactly are you planning?" "Nothing. Just a scare. A small warning. Let the boss know the price of going soft." Sophie didn't fully understand their words, but something cold and frightening seeped through their voices and their eyes. She slowly backed away, careful not to make a sound, but her hair clip slipped from her fingers and hit the stone path with a tiny clatter. Marco whipped his head around. He scanned the area and strode toward the bushes. Terrified, Sophie bolted, nearly tripping as she fled. Marco caught the glimpse of her small figure disappearing behind the corner of the wall, but he didn't chase after her. Instead, he looked at Jackson with a low, dark voice. "Be more careful next time. Kids hear everything." Sophie ran all the way back to the mansion, her face white as chalk. When she reached Emily, she clung to her mother and trembled as she recounted what she had heard. Gabriel was just descending the grand staircase. He stopped, listening to every word, his expression unreadable, though his eyes froze into something sharp as steel. He stepped forward and knelt to meet Sophie's gaze. "Are you sure you heard correctly?" Sophie nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks. "They said, 'I'm your weakness, and that if they scare me, you'll hurt inside.'" Emily held her daughter tighter while Gabriel rose to his full height, every line of his body coiled with tension. He didn't say a word. He simply took out his phone and dialed a familiar number. Within 10 minutes, the entire security team was gathered in the main conference room. Marco and Jackson stood in their usual corner, trying to project calm. Gabriel didn't need to shout. His voice was low, steady, carrying more weight than a roar. "Did any of you threaten that child?" Silence. He swept his gaze across the room, then fixed it on Jackson. "And you?" Jackson swallowed hard. "I didn't threaten anyone, we were just talking." Maybe she misheard. That 7-year-old did not mishear, and I don't need evidence to know exactly what you did. Gabriel moved closer, slowly, deliberately. "I've tolerated your resentment. I've let you whisper, scheme, grumble so long as none of it touched what I consider my family. But now that line has been crossed." He turned to Marco. "You were once the man I trusted most. But if you think I will stand still while a child is dragged into some pathetic power play, then you never understood me at all." Marco clenched his jaw, his eyes darkening. "We didn't hurt her. But you frightened her. And in this house, anyone who scares Sophie has no place here." Gabriel lifted a hand. 2 newly transferred guards stepped forward, escorting Jackson out of the room, while Marco was stripped of his internal access badge and reassigned to the transport division. No one spoke. No one dared. After the room emptied, Gabriel returned to Sophie, who was now sitting in the reading room with Emily. He sat beside the little girl and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "No one will hurt you here. If they try once, they will never get a second chance." Sophie nodded, then whispered, "I don't want you to be sad because of me." Gabriel looked into her eyes and saw his own childhood reflected back, small, powerless, watching cruelty in helpless silence. "You are the reason I'm not allowed to be sad," he murmured, "because now I have something worth holding the world together for." And in that moment, Gabriel knew one truth with absolute clarity. Anyone who still believed love was weakness would have no place in the empire he was rebuilding. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. The image of Gabriel in the conference room, his ice-cold eyes, his voice sharp enough to cut through bone, played again and again in her mind like a slow-motion reel. That same man, who once sat by her hospital bed, who placed a gentler than a father hand on Sophie's shoulder, was the very man who could make even the toughest men tremble with a single glance. There was another side to Gabriel, a darker one, a side no one dared speak of. And now Emily had seen it more clearly than ever. She sat up, slipped on her robe, and left the bedroom quietly. The hallway stretched long and dim, the low lights casting shadows over the dark wood-paneled walls. The mansion seemed to hold its breath, as if afraid to disturb the sleep of the man who ruled it. But she knew he wasn't asleep. She stopped before the door to his office and knocked twice. A quiet, "Come in," answered her. Not surprised, not hesitant, as if he had known she would come. Gabriel sat behind his desk, a glass of nearly empty whiskey in hand, the desk lamp outlining every weathered line of his face. Emily stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "I couldn't sleep. Neither can I." He set the glass down, his gaze still fixed on the fire flickering in the hearth. Emily moved closer, hesitating before she spoke in a soft voice. "This afternoon, you were frightening." Gabriel tilted his head slightly, not defensive, simply acknowledging. I know. Sophie saw it too. She didn't say anything, but I could feel it. Gabriel closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, weariness clouding his tone. I used to be a child like her, Emily. Small, powerless, always under threat from people bigger and colder. And I swore, if I ever had power, I would never let anyone hurt someone I cared about. Today, I only kept that promise to the boy I once was. Emily sat in the armchair opposite him, her fingers interlaced in her lap. I understand. But that doesn't make you any less frightening. To them, you're a man who can erase someone's existence with a single nod. Gabriel let out a soft, humorless breath. And to you, what am I? The question stunned her. She didn't know. Or more truthfully, she had never dared to define him with any singular label. He wasn't just her employer, not just the man who saved her and her daughter. He was a living contradiction between shadow and light, between iron discipline and unexpected tenderness. After a long pause, she replied, You are someone I don't fully understand yet. Gabriel accepted the answer with a quiet nod. He stood and walked to the window, staring into the dim garden outside. I don't blame you. Sometimes I don't understand myself either. 30 years surviving on fear and power, I thought that was the only way. Then a child walked into my life holding a stale piece of bread, and suddenly I began questioning everything. Emily joined him, standing close though an invisible boundary still lingered between them. You did the right thing today. For Sophie. For me. But if you want to keep the good in your life, you have to learn to control the rest of yourself. Gabriel looked at her, his gaze like a deep night sea full of unseen storms. I'm trying, but sometimes that part of me is the only thing that can protect everything I care about. Emily didn't argue. She reached over, gently lifted his half-finished whiskey, and poured water into the glass instead. A small gesture, but one heavy with meaning. She wasn't trying to change him. She was simply there, an anchor, a reminder that not all power had to be shown with a clenched fist. Gabriel accepted the glass and took a quiet sip. In the warm room, two people carrying old scars stood side by side, imperfect, uncertain, but undeniably real. And in that moment, Emily realized she had just seen a different face of Gabriel, a face not meant for loyal soldiers or prowling enemies. It was the face of a man slowly, quietly, learning how to be human again. A moment later, as the two of them still stood by the window, the garden lights casting soft reflections over the rustling leaves outside, Gabriel began to speak, his voice lower and more distant than usual, as though he were talking to himself rather than to Emily. For the first time in years, he told her about where he came from. A cramped apartment in the Bronx, where gunshots and shouting were the soundtrack of every night. His mother was the only person he ever trusted in the first 15 years of his life, until the day she collapsed behind the counter of the grocery store where she worked, and no one helped her. She died from exhaustion after working herself past every limit to pay for medication for an unnamed illness, and because she didn't have enough money for a doctor. Gabriel, 15 years old, stood in the morgue and couldn't cry. From that day on, he was no longer a child. He followed a man with a serpent smile, someone who promised him power, money, and most importantly, the assurance that he would never have to beg anyone again. Emily listened in silence, her chest tightening every time Gabriel paused to swallow a bitter memory. She could see the boy he once was, the child so hungry he stole the crusts of pizza from trash bins, the child who wished for a single embrace that wasn't tied to a condition. Gabriel continued, saying that at first he believed cruelty was a kind of armor, that if he made others fear him, then no one would be able to hurt him again. But fear never slept, and the price of power was a loneliness so deep it echoed. He built an empire not out of ambition, but out of a desperate need to control everything, so he would never relive the helplessness of his childhood. Emily touched his arm gently, as if anchoring him back to the present. She asked quietly why he had opened his heart to Sophie and to her. Gabriel looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because Sophie's eyes that day, when she begged him not to fire her mother, reminded him of the boy he once saw reflected in a bathroom mirror, the boy silently begging his own mother not to die, not to leave him, and he had been powerless. But this time was different. This time he could do something. He had power, money, and strength to keep another child from falling into the same darkness he had known. And because of Emily, a woman who endured everything in silence, never begged, never demanded, yet carried a quiet pride in every gesture that he couldn't ignore. She asked for nothing, but made him want to give everything. Emily's voice trembled as she admitted she once thought she was strong, until she saw her own child eating leftover scraps so quietly that the air itself felt afraid to move. She had felt like a failure. But now, seeing Sophie laugh, study, eat a full dinner without counting bites, she knew she had done right by teaching her daughter not to steal, not to complain, only to live kindly even in hardship. Gabriel nodded, saying softly that this was exactly why he chose to protect them at all costs. In that moment, they were no longer a crime boss and a housemaid, no longer two lives that once seemed impossible to cross. They were two wounded souls trying to stitch themselves back together through the presence of the other. When Emily left his office to return to her room, she glanced back. Gabriel was still standing there, watching her, his eyes no longer frozen like ice but holding a faint glow from some deep and long-shuttered place. She smiled a small, gentle smile, but one Gabriel tucked into his heart like a quiet promise that tomorrow he would keep trying to change. Not out of debt to his past, but out of a longing to walk toward a different future, one where darkness was no longer the only refuge. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the white curtains and poured golden warmth over the vast kitchen, soft as honey. Sophie sat at the table coloring quietly in a picture book, while Emily stood near the oven, checking the loaf of bread she had risen early to bake. Gabriel walked in without a word at first, simply watching them. They belonged to one another so naturally, yet strangely. The sight felt like something that had become part of his own life. He no longer felt like he was standing in his house, but rather that he was being invited into a warmth he had never known. After breakfast, when Sophie had gone upstairs to study with her tutor, Gabriel called Emily into his office. She entered with a trace of unease, because for the past week, every conversation with Gabriel had brought something unexpected, something far beyond anything she could have imagined. He invited her to sit, no longer the cold employer he once was, but a man preparing to say something important, something that might alter the course of all three of their lives. Gabriel placed a file in front of her. The dark blue cover was neatly pressed, its corners protected. On the top were the words, "Adoption Proposal, Sophie Dawson." Emily froze, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might burst. She looked at Gabriel, searching for any sign that this was a joke, a test of power, but no. His eyes were steady, sincere, anchored in an absolute seriousness. "I want to do this the right way," he said, his voice low and firm. "Not as a man buying loyalty, but as someone who wants to be a legal protector for a child I care deeply about." Emily still couldn't speak. Her lips trembled, her hands tightening on the table to keep herself steady. Gabriel went on, "I've spoken to my lawyer. If you agree, I will take full responsibility for Sophie, even if you no longer work here. No matter what happens between you and me, she will never go back to hunger or fear or uncertainty. I promise that with everything I have." The final sentence fell like a vow, not a transaction, but a promise, weighty enough to shape a lifetime. Emily reached out and touched the file, as though it were something sacred she wasn't yet sure she deserved to hold. "Do you understand what this means?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "I've lived my whole life terrified of losing everything because I had no power. But you're offering me something I never dared to dream of." Gabriel leaned forward slightly, his expression softening as though he wished he could calm every fear in her heart. "I can't replace Sophie's father, nor do I intend to erase her past. But if I can make her future steadier, safer, I will. Not to make amends for my own sins, but because I truly want to be her father." Emily couldn't hold back her tears. She pressed a hand to her chest, as if trying to keep her overflowing heart from spilling out. "Sophie, no one has ever asked her what she wanted. No one has ever signed anything just to keep her near. People have always believed a poor child should be grateful for any corner she's allowed to exist in. But you want to do the right thing simply because she deserves it, not because of what she can give you." Gabriel stood and moved beside her, offering his hand gently as though afraid of breaking her. "I want both of you to stay. Not as servants, not as people who owe me anything, but as part of this family." Emily took his hand her initiative for the first time. She nodded, not with words, but with a certainty shining in her eyes. And Gabriel, a man who had never truly believed in the idea of family, knew he had just stepped into a new chapter of his life. One where he was no longer a ruler of shadows, but a father learning to love in the quiet, honest light. On the main wall of the grand living room in Gabriel's mansion, where priceless European auction pieces once hung, there now rested a very different kind of artwork. It was a crayon drawing on uneven paper, carefully framed behind glass. In the picture were three figures: a man in a black suit standing in the center, holding two small hands on either side. On one side was a curly-haired little girl with wide, bright eyes. On the other was a long-haired woman in a green dress. Above them, written in clumsy yet heartfelt handwriting, were the words, "My family." It wasn't painted by a master, nor was it worth millions, but to Gabriel, it was the most precious thing he had ever owned. In the months after Gabriel officially adopted Sophie, everything in the mansion seemed to shift little by little. It was no longer a cold fortress built for power and strategy. It had become a real home. The kitchen always smelled of warm bread. The living room echoed with laughter. And every night, a small girl ran to Gabriel, wrapped her arms around him, and wished him good night, something he had never imagined for himself. Emily, no longer a housemaid but a companion in every meaningful way, had become the woman he trusted and respected. She now oversaw all the charitable projects Gabriel quietly funded: medical support foundations, scholarships for children in hardship, and community kitchens, each program operating under one shared name: Sophie's Light. Few knew that the once feared crime lord was the man behind it all. They only saw an organization filled with warmth and humanity. And perhaps that was exactly what Gabriel wanted: to redeem the past through the goodness he chose to build in the present. The story of Gabriel, Emily, and Sophie was not a fairy tale. It was written with tears, courage, and the choice to change. Gabriel had once believed that power was the only thing that kept him alive, but now he understood that love was what truly held him to this world. And love did not need to come from blood. A family is where someone waits for you to come home, where someone protects you, and where someone inspires you to become a better version of yourself. Sometimes, something as small as sharing a piece of bread can open an entirely new chapter in someone's life. Today's story is proof that compassion, even in the unlikeliest soil, can take root and grow into something extraordinary: a real family. And you? How did this story make you feel? Have you ever crossed paths with a little Sophie of your own in the middle of life's rush? Has there ever been a moment when someone's gaze changed something inside you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear from your hearts, the hearts of those who cherish these tender human stories. If this story touched you, don't forget to like and share it so its message can reach even further. And please subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the stories that speak to the soul, the journeys that move us every day. Thank you for staying with us until the very end, wishing you good health, joyful days, and a warm heart always. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.